Welcome to Skynet Today's Last Week in AI podcast, where you can hear us chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we'll summarize and discuss some of last week's most interesting AI news. You can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai for articles we did not cover in this episode. I'm Jeremy Harris, one of your hosts. I work on AI safety, AI policy stuff. I have a startup called Gladstone AI and a book called Quantum Physics Made Me Do It, which you can check out if you want. And I'm here with Andre. What's up, Andre?
Yes, I'm Andre, your host, Dr. Andre, as of
a
couple of weeks ago. Yeah, Dr. Andre. I'm a graduate from Stanford, where I studied robotics and AI, and now I'm working at one of these Silicon Valley AI startups. So as usual, we're going to, before talking about the news, do a quick response to some listener comments. Thanks to everyone who comments or corrects us or just gives us general feedback. You can email us at contact@lastweekin.ai or comment on YouTube or Substack or give us a review on Apple Podcasts. So we have a couple of them. We had an email from Nico who had some pretty good feedback on us focusing more of the discussion on areas where we have personal expertise, not getting into too much of a weeds on, let's say, legal stuff or stuff like medicine, where we are kind of, doing a lot of speculation. And I do think that's pretty good feedback.
Yeah, always helpful to get that kind of thought. Some of this is obviously speculation, and it's hard to know where to draw the line sometimes. I think in this particular instance, we were talking about consulting work and the extent to which consultants understand AI, which in this particular case, I will say I actually do have a fair bit of experience with this. I've run a training program for some very senior consultants at some pretty top level firms. And my comments were sort of informed by that experience, but I definitely get this perspective. And I think it's something for sure with legal things and medical stuff, at the very least, for us to flag when we're definitely not lawyers or doctors or things like that we can highlight maybe more clearly.
Yeah, and it's a good thing to keep in mind for listeners. We are giving our takes, but we might be giving the wrong takes.
This is not legal advice.
Yes. And we had one more feedback from Darius, who had some nice things to say. A lot of people have mentioned in response to our questions that they do like some of our commentary in addition to summaries, which is great to hear. And there was a question as well here. So Darius asked, what's the trend in AI-related content? E.g., are we 2x 2022 in terms of number of papers, articles, etc.? Surely it's growing exponentially. And yes, actually AI content, let's say, for instance, number of papers has been growing exponentially for a while, for at least a decade. And it's kind of crazy nowadays with conferences. It's a real problem in AI now, just the number of submissions you get. You literally need to have reviewers for thousands of papers that are getting submitted. And let's just say the process is something that a lot of us academics find to be pretty flawed. A lot of reviews are low quality, and it's really a slightly random process. And yeah, there's been growing pains in this crazy exponential trend we've seen for a decade.
Yeah, and it's far more people much more new to the field than who have a lot of experience in it too. So I guess when it comes to review, you'll have fewer people who can actually provide that kind of thoughtful input, I assume, at this point.
Yeah, perhaps. More people, I think, are being more informed. I have been pretty, positive on AI coverage in the media, where more and more reporters that are more knowledgeable and come from a place of, having understood the stuff. But, now we have all these influencers and, a lot of commentary that maybe isn't as informed. And I will mention, if you're curious about trends in AI-related content, you can check out the AI index reports from Stanford. We've covered them a couple of times, and they give a very nice high-level view that is not technically difficult to understand, but they cover a whole bunch of trends that are happening for things like, let's say different laws that are introduced, how many laws are being introduced in Congress. There's been a big jump and things like that, how many deals, all of that.
Yeah, it's becoming like really hard to ignore the space for sure. And anyway, we've got so many stories even this week that just hit that like nail right on the head. So
exactly. And yes, so again, thank you for that feedback and your questions. And now we're going to jump into the news coverage, starting with tools and apps. We have these AI humans are letting gamers modify their voices in real time. And this is about Spanish AI firm VoiceMod. This is about Spanish AI firm VoiceMod, which has released 20 AI humans that allow gamers to modify their voices in real time in video games. And these are trained from professional human voice actors, and you can download it and use it as a virtual microphone app for Apple, Mac, or Windows PC.
yeah, I think one of the really big shifts here is the real-time nature of this too, right? Like we've had for a long time kind of voice synthesis, voice cloning that's been not real-time. But when you think about like the range of applications being able to do this in real time, both from a beneficial application standpoint, like this, right? You can essentially do impressions, or it can do impressions for you, but also from a malicious use standpoint, like now you can get into like having fun with fraud and having an actual conversation instead of using pre-recorded kind of snippets. So this is an interesting shift. Obviously, the company here is looking at the watermarking solution to help identify voices that are generated using these sorts of systems. But ultimately, the reality is that we're here and this technology exists. So some actors are going to be good and they'll use the watermarks, and some won't be, and it's going to be a little bit murkier going forward to know who you're talking to on the phone.
For sure. VoiceMod has raised 23 million in funding, and I think it is a cool little application. I remember I had over COVID a little D&D campaign we were doing online, and I was the dungeon master. And I'm not a great actor, I gotta admit, so I did play around with some of these voice kind of modifiers to try and do some of the non-playable characters. I think hopefully we'll see a lot of fun applications of this as well.
Next up, we have new Clippy app gives us a taste of AI in Windows 11. And if you're over the age of, I want to say, 27, 28 or something like that, maybe you know Clippy. How old are you, Andre? Maybe this is...
I'm a 30 years old, and okay. I know Clippy. I think maybe 25 is the threshold.
Oh, yeah?
But yeah, it's been a while since Clippy has been around, I guess.
Oh, God bless Clippy. Okay, so if you remember it, right, it's this thing where you open Word and there's this little icon of like a paperclip, and it's an animated character with eyes, and he's there to help you and blah, blah, blah. He was never really helpful, but he was this like lovable kind of Microsoft character. And it turns out that there's a company called Firecube Studios that's making a kind of AI-powered, ChatGPT-powered version of Clippy. And it's not like, I was trying to figure this out. It wasn't super clear if this was officially endorsed, like an officially endorsed Clippy. Surely they figured out the copyright somehow. But it is being made by Firecube Studios, and looks like it's essentially going to be this aid, this assistant that lives kind of on your Windows kind of OS. And so at any time you can pull it up, and it's kind of like the Windows Copilot, though that integration is a little bit more tightly integrated with Windows. So kind of this lovable character back on your screen, so to speak. And you do have to enter your ChatGPT API key, though, to make it work. So that's an interesting kind of issue, because obviously you're going to have to pay for your use of the ChatGPT API that's powering this whole thing. But I don't know. What did you think, Andre?
Yeah, it's fun. There is Clippy, the character on there. I don't get the impression this is actually sanctioned by Microsoft, but you can download it on the Microsoft Store. As far as I can tell, it's kind of just an interface to access ChatGPT, so you can do all the things you could do with ChatGPT about it, or what you can do with ChatGPT with it. And it kind of is pretty similar to Windows Copilot, which we've discussed, and that actually is more deeply connected to Windows itself. I don't know that this can modify many Windows settings, but if you'd like to have ChatGPT just directly on your Windows screen, this could be one thing to try out.
Apparently, they're also introducing other characters too. If you remember Microsoft Bob, I don't know if anybody else played with the other characters besides Clippy, but there was Microsoft Bob. I think it was Microsoft Bob and a couple other characters. So anyway, if you're really waiting for those, they will be out.
Yeah, it's a fun little thing for sure. And just one more story we'll cover pretty quickly. We have ChatGPT on iOS now comes with Bing built in, and that's pretty much it. The app, if you're a paid user, allows you to access information from Microsoft's Bing search engine. I think we've chatted a little bit about how ChatGPT is adding this web search feature, which allows it to access information that's not in its training data set. And the free version of ChatGPT can only provide information up to the year 2021, versus if you do have this paid feature, you can ask it about present day stuff.
Yeah, I think this is all part of OpenAI just trying to figure out where to draw the line in terms of what they charge for and what they don't charge for in like classic software as a service, right? Like we have this kind of well-established intuition about what threshold you start charging people, above a certain user number, above a certain capability, certain set of capabilities or something. And it seems like here, like one way that they're drawing the line is like the freshness of the training data, which is kind of a cool feature. And moving on to applications in business, we start with junk websites filled with AI generated text are pulling in money from programmatic ads. And this is like, a preview of the future shitty internet, apparently, brought to you by AI. So about 140 major brands are apparently paying for ads right now that end up on these like very sketchy AI written sites, often without their knowledge, just because a lot of ad placement is done automatically through algorithms that decide where to serve your ads. And so sometimes they end up on these websites that are known as made for advertising sites. So basically you can imagine, back in the day, the way this worked was you'd have like click farms or just like kind of very low quality labor that you would use to just pump out a crap ton of clickbaity kind of websites with spammy content. And now it turns out that AI is really good at doing clickbaity websites with spammy content. And so that's something that's being used to gobble up a bunch of this ad revenue that otherwise would be used to place ads in, I guess, better, more constructive places.
Yeah, the numbers here are pretty crazy. NewsGuard has apparently identified around 25 new AI-generated sites each week, with 217 found in 13 languages since April. I guess it's not too surprising. It's part of this ongoing, arms race between people trying to trick SEO and, game the system. And, presumably now these advertisers need to be able to detect AI-generated websites and avoid this sort of thing. So, not too surprising that this would be a new tool that people use. And yeah, as you said, a bit of a preview on the way the internet will just be filled with noise even more than it is now.
Yeah, apparently, and may already, like a big chunk apparently already is. Like, so I was just looking at the article. You mentioned really interesting numbers. Another one I found interesting was 21% of ad impressions in the sample that was looked at here went to these kinds of sites. That's $13 billion globally wasted on these sites each year. So like it's already like a drag on this entire industry, which anyway, I would not have expected this early.
Yeah, me too. Next story, AI startups buck funding winter grow share in 2023. And so, yes, VC investments in AI startups have increased from 10% in 2022 to 15% in the first 5 months of 2023. I'm assuming that means 10% of all VC funding. And this is at a time where VC investments in general have slowed down a lot with the state of the economy and just general sort of lessons learned from the past decade. But AI investments on the rise, as you might imagine. And we'll be covering a lot of those stories coming up in the lightning round. So yeah, it's as you might imagine and might have been expected, this is actually happening.
Yeah, and I don't know if we cover this explicitly in the lightning round. I'm trying to remember, but the latest Y Combinator batch was like dozens and dozens of AI startups, and I think like an interesting question. You hear people say, "Oh well, it's this is just a fad, like it'll pass like the crypto bubble or whatever. We're in an AI bubble." And what's clearly prompted this is stuff like ChatGPT. But I think one of the things that tells us is, given the rate of acceleration capabilities, it's quite possible that this is not in fact a bubble. That this funding might actually be really well allocated, and that's at least my bias looking at this. Also interesting that the macro climate hasn't actually like knocked the wind out of investors' sails completely, especially when it comes to AI. Who knows what these numbers would look like if we weren't staring a recession in the face. So this is pretty wild stuff. Dollars are expensive now with interest rates, and people are choosing to spend them in big ways on these tech startups.
Yeah, and probably, there's going to be a bit of a bubble, perhaps, in seed investing, I would imagine. There's just a huge sort of gold rush of new companies, and a lot of them will not work out. But as we'll cover soon, there are a lot of these very big deals going on that are with established companies. And I do think I agree that, this is real, and it's around here to stay.
I think you're actually sorry. That's a really good point. Like, what is a bubble and what isn't? This one feels like a hybrid, like spaghetti monster of bubble, not bubble, where you have, there's some obviously low quality companies, or at least like, if you're in the space, you understand the tech, you're just like, all right, this is like, there's no moat here. There's no competitive advantage. Like, this is going to fizzle out. But then there are others where it's like, whoa, like, how have you not raised at an even bigger valuation? Sometimes, not always. But it seems like it's this like living contradiction that we're seeing right now in that market. And it almost seems, though I have no better way of thinking about it, but it almost seems like if we had a way to segment those two and just look at like, especially AI hardware companies, often seem a little bit more legit these days relative to some of the application domain stuff. Like, I feel like that's one axis where they resolve pretty neatly. It's not to say there aren't great application companies, just maybe a little bit more imbalanced type there. I don't know. What do you think, Andre?
Yeah, I think that's right. There are various ways to dig more into the data, and I think the AI index partially does this. So you can break down by stage of investing, seed versus A versus B, etc. So yeah, we'll see a mix here of maybe some investments turn out to be not very wise as people just rush in to get in on this. But at the same time, I do feel there's a lot of understanding from, let's say, people investing on what is really, a major player versus someone who has a lot of competition and might not work out.
Yeah, you could burn like a lot of naive dollars, I feel like, at this stage, just throwing money at this space.
Yeah.
And moving on to our lightning round, we have the TSA will use facial recognition in over 400 airports. And so it's looking to the TSA, that is, the Transportation Security Administration, is looking to expand its program to around 430 US airports over the next couple of years. They claim that their program has shown 97% effectiveness across all demographics. And they explicitly say here, including those with dark skin. And so, it's interesting, like 97% effectiveness, depending on how this analysis is actually used in the back end, that could either be really good or like kind of bad, because it's like, if what happens when there's a misfire matters a lot here. Are we talking about just pulling somebody aside? Are we talking about, like, I don't know, other things that could be more serious? Having an extra 1 in 30 chance of getting pulled aside or getting delayed is, not a trivial thing. But anyway, they're looking at a bunch of separate pilots looking at travelers' images and comparing them to a government database. But they say only trusted travelers are currently included. So anyway, a bunch of privacy concerns, as you could imagine, coming out of this stuff.
Yeah, and I will say I think it's probably true that it's very good. Facial recognition is very mature at this point, so I can see why it would make sense to do this. I've already experienced with like passport checks when you do international travel. It's actually quite convenient to not have to go through a person. So personally, I like this idea, but of course, you can ask whether we want this to be possible. Next story, OpenAI chooses London for its first corporate office outside the US. Not much else to say on this. OpenAI is expanding. You could argue that maybe this has implications for, London and the UK being friendly to AI in terms of regulation. Maybe they don't want to be in the EU. They want to be in the not EU, UK now. But yeah, that's pretty much all we know from this.
Yeah, it definitely does align with some of the stuff we've seen out of OpenAI, their increased focus on government lobbying. My guess is this is probably going to be about, in part at least, lobbying the UK government because of this big UK AI summit that's happening at the end of the year. And also because the EU is right next door, right? You've got this bastion of AI regulation there. So probably having an office there isn't going to hurt.
Yep.
And next we have Unity shares rise 12% after company announces AI marketplace. So the shares go up 12%. The marketplace is for AI software, essentially a kind of platform play. And the idea is to allow people to choose from different pieces of AI software that generate game dialogue or textures or graphics from independent companies. And this is actually a trend that, I don't know, I find kind of exciting. Like, it's this idea of having essentially an assistant to help people find kind of more narrow AI tools that can solve for really kind of specific and important tasks. And the platform play seems really cool. We've seen, I think last week we saw OpenAI kind of move in that direction, looking to set up an AI marketplace as well. This one kind of more game focused, obviously, but interesting sign of maybe things to come. Like, I wonder if we see more of a move in this direction as aggregators start to become more and more important and serving up more narrow systems and helping with search.
Yeah, for those who don't know, possibly Unity is one of the major game engines that is used in a lot of the industry. It's really quite dominant, and their asset store already is a big deal. They have a lot of assets, some music and visuals and packages of code. So yeah, it is a good idea, and the shares do reflect that. Okay, and now we're gonna do a lightning round with a lot of stories about fundings. So first, we have a story that Inflection lands 1.3 billion investment to build more personal AI. We just talked about Inflection recently in terms of them having one of these language model plays. So I mean, wow. And with this, we're planning to build AI supercomputer with 22,000 NVIDIA H1000 GPUs, which is kind of insane.
Yeah, seeing the H100 kind of become this dominant workhorse of the system, like switch over from A100s, which we used to see in these kinds of announcements, to H100s. Anyway, kind of little cool detail here, but damn, that's a big raise.
Mm-hmm. Next, we have Runway, a startup building generative AI for content creators, raises 141 million. We've talked about Runway before. It's mainly for video editing, and they seem to be pretty dominant in the space. Yeah, now they have a bunch more money. They're valued at 1.5 billion.
Yeah, and I think NVIDIA also invested in them earlier on. So I'm not sure if that's part of this round or if that happened earlier, but cool.
And after that, we have Typeface, which is building generative AI for brands. They raised 100 million at a 1 billion valuation. So this is more of a focus on enterprise use cases. And it consists of a content hub, AI-powered training and personalization, and stuff like that.
Another enterprise play. I feel like it's now at the point where it's like, they raise 100 million. Is that really news? Is $100 million really news? That's just the world. Anyway.
Yeah, and speaking of hardware, next we have Celestial AI, which also raised 100 million for their light-based interconnects, and this is for data transmission. One of the very important things for doing training with large clusters of compute. So I guess it makes sense that this would be useful, and also this could cut costs in data centers by 4 to 5%.
Yeah, the interconnect bandwidth is like this really key dimension, let's say, to GPUs or to compute generally, because like when you have to put a bunch of GPUs together, they got to communicate with each other to train these very large models. And this optics-based thing, this light-based thing I've seen this as a trend. Like there are a bunch of companies working on similar stuff, including I think Fathom Radiant, which is anyway. Another trend.
And another trend, and still a couple more funding stories. Almost done, though. We have Gleamer, which provides AI software for radiologists, raises 29.5 million. This is a French company. This is their Series B funding, and their flagship software is BoneView, which directs radiologists to areas of a scan that may indicate anomalies.
Yeah, I'm really excited just broadly about the medical applications of this. So cool to see fundraisers there.
Definitely, yeah. And cool to see things maturing to a point where doctors are using these sorts of tools.
Yeah, and in France too. Bravo, les gars.
Last up, we have Parrot, an AI-powered transcription platform that turns speech to text, raises 11 million Series A. So yeah, there you go. They unveiled a feature that summarizes depositions in seconds for legal experts, and they, I guess, are focusing on this. They aim to streamline the deposition process.
Yep, another fundraise. What can I say? Looks good.
Looks good.
Congrats, Parrot. So next up, we're moving on to straight up acquisitions with Databricks strikes $1.3 billion deal for generative AI startup MosaicML. MosaicML is a large language model platform, and they specialize in low-cost language models and working with proprietary data. It's kind of maybe more of an enterprise play, helping companies work with like their own internal data, hooking it up to large language models. And so, interesting move here by Databricks.
Yeah, MosaicML is still pretty young. It has 62 employees and has raised 64 million. So this seems like a pretty proactive move on Databricks' part. And Databricks is a pretty major company in data storage and management.
And then next we have Meituan buys founder's months-old OpenAI for China for $234 million. This, I think, is actually a really interesting story. So basically, this is a super young startup. It was started by a guru and kind of AI guru in China and was bought. It was acquired for basically the same amount of money that they had in the bank plus liabilities. So essentially, like they were acquiring it kind of at no cost, buying up just the team. And it's sort of seen as a bit of a sputtering out, maybe, of this, what was once thought to be OpenAI for China. This company is called Light Years Beyond. It has a Chinese name as well, which I'm not going to try to pronounce because I'll butcher it. But yeah, I think a really interesting kind of example of maybe AI hype in China, not quite translating, at least in this particular instance. They were backed by Sequoia China back in the day, too.
Yeah, and it kind of shows OpenAI for China. OpenAI is hard to replicate. You need a lot of infrastructure. So you're gonna probably have, we already covered a few companies that are trying to get into that space. A lot of them are not gonna be able to catch up, I think.
Yeah. And next we have, as the generative AI craze rages on, Ramp acquires customer support startup Cohere.io. And so this is essentially, just to be clear, this is not Cohere. What is their website? Anyway, there's a big multi-billion-dollar startup, large language model startup called Cohere. This is not that startup. This is a startup that's specialized in customer support. So Cohere raised $1.3 million in seed funding. They had over 200 customers at the time of the acquisition, and they basically extract customer support data and help to automatically resolve tickets. They claim they can hit 60% of tickets automatically resolved.
Yeah, another very practical and useful business use case here.
And then we have NVIDIA acquired AI startup that shrinks machine learning models. And I think this is another really interesting one because you've got here, so there's this company called Determined AI, and essentially what they do is they take big models and then they shrink them using techniques we've discussed on the podcast in the past, like model distillation, that sort of thing. And this is, I think, really significant because NVIDIA is looking to own more and more of the AI stack. And increasingly, it's become clear that that has to include owning the model shrinkage part of the stack. Model shrinkage is super, super important because sometimes you want to put a model on an edge device, for example, that can't fit a fully scaled model. Or you find that, hey, like 99% of the expense in running a model doesn't come from training it, it comes from inference, it comes from deploying it. And it's much cheaper to run a smaller version of a big model than the full big model. And so people often do this to get cost savings. So strategically, I think this is another example of NVIDIA trying to like flesh out their ownership of the stack here.
Yeah, I wonder how many acquisitions are happening at NVIDIA. I imagine this is one among many they're going to be doing this year. And moving on to projects and open source, we only have one story this week in here. And this is kind of a blog post unraveling GPU inference costs for fine-tuned open source models versus closed platforms. This is from MLOps.community. It is written by the co-founder of Inference, which is building a serverless infra for AI companies. So I do take this with a bit of a grain of salt, but it's still pretty interesting. So this does some of that analysis, as it says, and you can basically infer that if you host your own models with AWS cloud computing, you can cut costs from using an API like ChatGPT by quite a bit. So according to this analysis, as you scale initially with a small number of users, you can get away with a third of the cost. And as you go up to 20,000 users, it goes down to about a fourth of the cost if you do your own infrastructure versus if you're using OpenAI. So yeah, and this is another case where the release of a lot of these open source models that are commercially licensed is really going to change up a lot of the game, I think, for companies.
It will, and it's also, I think, highlights the different use cases. Like, it is true that not everyone needs to run, GPT-4, GPT 3.5, whatever in the background. Like, yeah, sure, you can often use like open source models, but the value that you're getting, like OpenAI isn't tripling the cost on top of open source models for no reason. They're like offering you all kinds of support. They're doing a bunch of security and safety screenings and essentially allowing you to like outsource liability as well. Like if a model goes wrong, you can like complain to OpenAI, you can get help resolving it. The models are kept up to date, that sort of thing. So it's, you're definitely getting value for that. I don't know that I find it so surprising that there's like a 3x to 4x lift. It's also not super surprising that as you scale more, the economics start to favor hosting your own model too. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. This kind of makes sense to me. It doesn't seem like necessarily much of a ripoff. I think the framing of the article seemed to be that like, oh, wow, look at the discrepancy. There certainly is one, and you'd expect there to be one. But I guess I don't know. I didn't find it so shocking.
No, I don't think it's very shocking. And I think now with open source models getting quite good, none of them quite as good as ChatGPT necessarily or GPT-4, but for a lot of applications, you don't need that top of line performance. So I think a lot of money is going to go to AWS for serving these things instead of OpenAI.
Again, AWS wins by selling shovels.
Yeah.
And now moving on to research and advancements, we have researchers from LinkedIn and UC Berkeley propose a new method to detect AI-generated profile photos. And so this is a collaboration between those researchers, UC Berkeley and LinkedIn, and they say that they can accurately identify generated, I was going to say fake, I guess fake, yeah, or AI-generated profile pictures 99.6% of the time. And they say that so this is contrasted with misidentifying genuine pictures as fake only 1% of the time. And so that's pretty good. I mean, it's in line certainly with what we've seen in other kind of general facial recognition things. I'd be really curious what the specifics of the data set were behind this. Like, obviously, depending on the method you use to generate these images, they'll have different artifacts embedded in them. So I'd be curious about how generalizable this strategy proves, like kind of beyond the data set that they used here. But it is, a good sign for the moment that there are techniques that can allow you to detect these things.
Yeah, we covered, I believe, last week the announcement that we are releasing this as a feature on the platform, but this time we are covering the paper itself. It's exposing GAN-generated profile photos from compact embeddings. And yeah, it's neat to see LinkedIn working with Berkeley and releasing this not just as a feature on their website, but also as this paper that actually produces an interesting new method for this quite important problem. Next story, we have China's Baidu claims its Ernie Bot beats ChatGPT on key test as AI race heats up. That's most of what we have here. So there's this AI model Ernie 3.5 from Baidu. Baidu is a giant company in China that is a bit similar to Google. And this says that Ernie surpassed ChatGPT and GPT-4 in Chinese language tests, but was behind GPT-4 in English. And yeah, Baidu has been in AI for a long time. They have quite a bit of research. They do autonomous driving. So it's not surprising to see them continuing to invest in this language model direction.
Yeah, a couple of things I thought were interesting about this, like one of which was just this is Baidu pumping out impressive performance, at least it seems to be, despite all of the semiconductor export control restrictions. So we know that Chinese tech companies and research labs have gotten really good, for example, at like combining together Frankenstein monster clusters that consist of different kinds of GPUs, which is a problem that just doesn't come up in the West, where you can, have an entire server farm of all A100 top of the line NVIDIA GPUs, and you don't need to worry about compatibility or whatever. So like this is going to be part of presumably what's going on in the back end here, and they're still able to pump out some pretty impressive results. I thought it was interesting that they call it Ernie 3.5, by the way, just because it implicitly invites you to compare this to GPT 3.5 rather than GPT 4, and it kind of invites a more favorable comparison. I thought that was kind of a funny and a good marketing move on their part.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's hard not to think that that's their intention here. So smart, I think. And one other thing I found interesting in the article, Baidu said one defining feature of this latest model is the ability to access plugins, which are apps that can be accessed via Ernie Bot. So for instance, Baidu's search feature has been integrated with Ernie Bot via plugin. So this also is part of a trend. OpenAI now has plugins, and apparently Ernie does too.
Yeah, and these are big improvements too, like relative to, I think they came out with Ernie 3.0 like a couple months ago, like 2 months, maybe 3 months ago. And like we're already here, it kind of climbing the ladder toward GPT-4 level capability-ish. And that I think is kind of the last thing I would highlight is just like how messed up it is to try to even assess like the relative capabilities of Chinese models versus English models. It's already hard enough to tell like which one is better between like Falcon and like, Llama or whatever else. Like we find that hard enough when these models are trained on very similar like English language corpuses. But here we have to do this weird apples to oranges comparison where we're comparing like GPT-4 in English to Ernie in Chinese. And so another challenge just in figuring out like who is doing what in AI and how well they're doing it.
Yep.
All right, moving on to our lightning round, we have LeanDojo, theorem proving with retrieval-augmented language models. Theorem proving is this really kind of, often considered a really important marker of progress in AI because it does require coherent thought, let's say, across a large number of steps generally. And there have been some really big steps in this direction in the past. And so now we have this model called LeanDojo that extracts proofs in Lean into data sets for training machine learning models. And it allows the trained model to prove theorems by interacting with Lean's proof environment. And so Lean is the company, I guess, behind this.
Lean is a theorem prover. I don't know exactly what the company behind it is, but yeah, it's a tool that can do theorem proving, and they, I guess, generate the data set from it and use it as a way to do this retrieval-augmented prover thing.
Okay, cool. Well, congrats to the team here. I guess, I mean, it's an important area to work on. I mean, I don't understand it nearly as well as I should, but seems like a nice advance.
Yeah, and I found it interesting. This is a collaboration across 5 organizations. It's called Tech, NVIDIA, MIT. So yeah, large team, and they also release the coded models, which is cool. Next story, self-improving robots embracing autonomy in robot learning. This is from Stanford, and this is talking about reinforcement learning, that, one of its real limitations is that you kind of train for a single thing at a time, and you need a lot of human involvement for robot learning specifically. So here they introduce this METAL algorithm that can train RL agents autonomously with minimal human interventions by learning, some fancy policy. There's a cool idea here where they learn policy to first do the task, and then they also learn how to undo the task, so you can reset the environment and can continuously learn by yourself. So yeah, as a robotics guy, I found this kind of interesting.
Yeah, it also seems to give them like an extra lever. Like they can reset, it seems, the initial starting state to kind of reset further back and make the task a little bit harder too. That seemed to be one of the themes of this strategy. So presumably this allows you to train the model on maybe easier versions of the problem at first, and as it gets better, kind of ramp up the difficulty level, almost like it seemed like almost like a learning rate schedule type thing, except in RL kind of real world reset stuff.
And speaking of self-improving robots, next we have new research from DeepMind titled RoboCat, a self-improving robotic agent. So it's not really the same idea, but similar. So RoboCat can pick up a new task with relatively few demonstrations. This is not quite RL, it's more learning from a demonstration. And it's called RoboCat because it is built on the Guapo model that was released last year. I think it was called
Gato, I think.
Gato, of course. I don't speak Spanish, but
it's a Guapo Gato.
Yeah. So yeah, here they use this whole idea of using some set of demonstrations to seed the robot, training it, and then practicing and generating more data, that sort of thing.
Yeah, my understanding from looking at this too is that one of the big things that they're seeing is this thing called positive transfer. So, there's this idea, back when Gato was first trained, in 2021, I want to say 2022, like anyway, decades ago in AI time, there was this issue where they trained it to master like 600 or 450 tasks or something. And the question was like, okay, if we now train it to do a new task, how much of its knowledge from other tasks is going to transfer over? And will that be better than training a purpose-built specialized model on that new task? And what they found then was actually, no, it's worse to kind of add another capability to this existing model. And so you have negative transfer. Here, they seem to be seeing positive transfer on this RoboCat thing that is based on the Gato model. And so that kind of seems like a pretty interesting and significant shift. Like they saw, it looks like a doubling of the success rate on kind of the next task after they had, that's slightly the wrong stat. But anyway, an improvement thanks to this stacking of capabilities, helping it to learn new capabilities as well. What was your thought on that, Andre, the positive transfer?
Yeah, I think it's very cool. And I think broadly, it's part of a trend in robotics research of trying to get to general models that can be adapted to different tasks and, go beyond, let's say, single task training like reinforcement learning usually does. And yeah, I think robotics has been really moving pretty fast and getting a lot of benefits from language models, a bit surprisingly, or the architecture of language models. So it's like an exciting time in the research world of robotics.
Yeah. The like ability of language models to understand the world seems to actually be starting to pay dividends, and like they can lean on the language models understanding the world to plan their next action and kind of orient themselves. Kind of counterintuitive. I'm like, I wouldn't have expected this like in 2019 or whatever, before scaling started in earnest.
Yeah, and there's also all these text vision models and various things that are coming together. And DeepMind has been doing a lot of that work, and it's been quite cool.
And next up, we have NVIDIA H100 GPUs set standard for generative AI in debut ML perf benchmark. Okay, so the one stat, if there was one thing that I was blown away by in this thing, it's the scary fast performance of these H100, these Hopper 100 GPUs. Again, these are the top of the line GPUs that NVIDIA has. And they tried using this cluster of like 3,500 Hopper 100 GPUs to train GPT-3. And so GPT-3, like back in the day, took months to train. No one knows exactly how many months right now, but they did it in 11 minutes with this cluster, which like, what the fuck? So yeah, compute is pretty, and I assume they didn't specify, but I assume they mean the full like 176 parameter GPT-3 with a data set comparably large, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's not too clear. It's the ML perf test or benchmark. So there's more details we can dive into. There's actually a bunch of tasks that are being tested, and they also go into, for instance, ResNet, a vision model, and you can do that in less than a minute, like 20 seconds, which is insane with these giant clusters of thousands of GPUs, which, by the way, co-developed by Inflection AI. So yeah, NVIDIA is getting gonna get a lot of business with Inflection, I guess.
Yeah, especially lately. They've got about a $1.3 billion of business more they're going to be getting based on that fundraise too. So
Exactly. And on to policy and safety, starting with from ChatGPT to executive orders inside the White House's urgent push to regulate AI. So the White House, as we've been covering, has been doing a lot of meetings in the SF area and elsewhere with a lot of the industry leaders and some of the academic leaders as well. And now they're unveiling, or will be unveiling this summer, some executive orders and other policy actions that will maximize the impact of existing regulations and establish guardrails, and also, I guess, push forward the ability of companies and government to develop AI. So yeah, it's just another story to cover this general trend. The White House apparently are building a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which is set to be released this year, supposedly. So moving very fast. And it's kind of a good indicator that, I think, with respect to this new technology, it's been around for a while, but now really there is a bit of a fire lit, and it appears, I think the government might be doing a good job here.
yeah, I mean, this is definitely one of those moments where, and the article goes into this, but like people are realizing, holy crap, the standard process for government, the standard legislative and regulatory process is way too slow to deal with these things. That's why we're seeing it dealt with through the executive branch with executive orders that don't have the same kind of legislative muscle behind them, and it's sometimes debated the extent to which they can be enforced, but it's certainly a much faster way to go. The Biden administration seems to be barreling head in. The story opens with Joe Biden checking out ChatGPT and what it can do and being blown away by it. Whether that's apocryphal or not, the point is ChatGPT really coming up again as a big kind of locus of concern, big focal point, drawing people's attention to the space. Another thing that was interesting in the story is they highlight the role of the White House Chief of Staff, Jeff Zients, who apparently has been really spearheading all this, really emphasizing the need for speed. And he had this quote. He's saying speed is really important here. If one acts too slowly, we're going to be behind by the time we take action, and our action is going to be leapfrogged by the technology. And so this is something that's come up just over and over again. People saying like, hey, you can do all the Senate hearings you want, you can do all this stuff, but like ultimately, some people have timelines for like reaching human level AI that could be as short as 2 years. Some say it might be 10, and it's considered long timelines if you're beyond 2030. So in that context, it's like, not everyone agrees, obviously, but it's just like if you have a chunk of people who think that, if you hit anywhere close to that mark in the coming decade, like everything changes. So the legislative environment just needs to hurry up and catch up really, really quickly. Last thing I'll mention is they do include a really good preview of a couple things to come. So Kamala Harris is going to be holding a summit on AI. It's more consumer protection focused. So it's not going to be kind of the big picture stuff that maybe is going to come up at the UK AI safety summit later. But that's kind of cool. And then there are a bunch of leading AI companies, including Google, Microsoft, and OpenAI, that are expected to announce privacy and safety commitments that are crafted, and I thought this was interesting, in coordination with the White House in the next little bit. And anyway, a bunch of other things around like the G7 coordinating with this stuff. So kind of a cool moment for AI regulation for sure.
Yeah. Quick self-correction. I misread the notes a little bit. So they're not developing the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. That was already released last year. Yeah. But they're developing or building on it. So it'll be kind of a start or indicate the approach of the government to AI policy. And I was just going to say, actually, that, it's good to see them moving fast. But on the other hand, GPT-3 has been around for a while. And as, I guess public knowledge or public awareness of this stuff really exploded with ChatGPT. But for a while in 2022, if you actually use GPT-3, you could see that it could do all this stuff. And that you could predict its massive impacts, I think, even a while back. So in a way, it's a little bit behind. It feels like we should have had more of an effort already for a couple of years, but it's good to see that we are really trying to move fast now.
I completely agree with you. And like, just kind of as a brief, like biographical note, just because it feels so relevant here, like in 2020, when GPT-3 came out, I actually like that was the moment for me where I left my startup and I went into AI safety full time for exactly the reason that you highlighted. It's like pretty obvious where the scaling thing goes, and GPT-3 could already do all this stuff. What I learned in the process of like just schlepping and trying to like talk to politicians as much as I could to understand how they were thinking about it is that they really are just people who got elected. Like politicians are literally just like your next door neighbor ran for office and they got elected, and they know what you would expect your next door neighbor to know. And so when you talk to them about the GPT-3 thing back then, the reaction was almost like, oh, this is very powerful, but it's like this very academic, very niche thing, rather than something that's going to like explode all over the world and just become this thing. So it's this weird disconnect. Like, I completely agree with you. They really ought to have, it was crystal clear to anybody who saw the story back then. And yet emotionally, it just, I don't know, until ChatGPT, people didn't see their kids using it. They didn't use it themselves. And I think that bar was shifted, but it's just like this really challenging problem of like, who do we elect? Like they've got to be people like us, and people like us, unless they happen to specialize in this area, they're just not going to know. And they're probably not going to take things as seriously as they perhaps should have back then.
Yeah. I think it's also a thing where, for regular people, it's one thing to hear about it. You really have to play around with ChatGPT and GPT-3 to really have it sink in. And that wasn't easy or even, doable for most people.
Good point.
Until ChatGPT. So probably it would have exploded if there was this open playground, but I think it was still sort of limited access until ChatGPT really. Next story we have in the lightning round. First, US considering new restrictions on AI chip exports to China, according to Wall Street Journal. So we've already covered quite a bit how there are already restrictions on really top of the line GPUs, which has been has been making a big impact, and NVIDIA had to release this other chip as an alternative. And I don't think there's many details here on what are the particular restrictions, but yeah, another really aggressive move here by the US.
Yeah, and I think it kind of makes sense. So it seems like what's happening is, the US came in and said like, okay, so as a reminder, the letters and the numbers, right? The A100 GPU was the workhorse top of the line GPU that NVIDIA made that everybody was using until like, I don't know, 20 minutes ago, when the H100 came out, which is this like terrifyingly powerful thing that we just talked about a little bit earlier in the podcast. And then so they were told, NVIDIA was told, hey, you can't just sell this shit to China. This is way too powerful. You're kind of arming the enemy here. So NVIDIA goes, no problem. We're just going to make the H800 and the A800. So instead of A100 and H800, now switch to the ones to the 8s. And that might have something to do with the fact that 8 is the lucky number in China, but that's just Jeremy speculating, so don't hold me to that. But anyway, we now have these new GPUs that are purpose made for China, and they have specifically low interconnect. So basically that property that we talked about as well earlier in the podcast. See, everything builds on itself. So now you have this like lower interconnect. These GPUs can't talk to each other as fast, essentially. So they're still really powerful, but they have that limitation that prevents you from building really big foundation models. Now what's happening, finally, is the Department of Commerce seems to be saying, hey, you can't sell even the H800 or the A800 chips without a special US export license. And how hard is it going to be to get that license? That's a separate question for, I believe, the Commerce Department, but like the regulatory authority there. And that might actually end up being a fairly easy process anyway. But certainly it means that, hey, NVIDIA, like you can't just like make a couple tweaks to your GPUs and keep selling them. Like, the bar is higher than that. And I think that's the kind of big shift that we're seeing, really trying to close off all those bases that Chinese companies might be exploiting right now.
Yeah. Still, like when the initial export restrictions were announced, I was pretty taken aback by how much of a, strong and pretty impactful move it was by the US. So it seems they're really committed to this course of action.
Yeah, I think the calculation that's happening right now is, we talk about malicious use all the time on the podcast. And like you think about those capabilities in the hands of an enemy, especially, China with its track record of using AI on like the Uyghur Muslim populations, on, just general kind of population control stuff like that, and then militarizing it. It's not that the US doesn't do that as well, but in the US's self-interest certainly is to like prevent a kind of an adversary state to access this like raw material that can power these applications. Next up, another heartwarming story: 17 fatalities, 736 crashes, the shocking toll of Tesla's autopilot. And this is a WAPO article basically looking at this investigation that revealed that there have been 736 crashes involving Tesla's autopilot system. This is just in the US. And since 2019, the important detail was that this is more than what had previously been reported. And there's a bunch of controversy over this as to whether we should be, the word happy can't be used here, but like whether we should actually be more okay or less okay with this. Like, is this more than what you get with human driving? Is it less? Elon Musk is claiming that actually, this is still a better track record than human drivers. And then some commenters in the article are saying like, well, in order to know that for sure, we'd have to have access to proprietary data that Tesla has on its kind of self-driving car system. So bit of an open question, it seems.
Yeah, it's hard to say. You would really need to know like where are people driving and how much they're driving. So this doesn't tell us too much. It does play into things we've discussed, I think, a couple months ago, maybe even last year, of investigations by the National Highway Authority about, in particular, Tesla's autopilot was not good at responding to emergency vehicles or perceiving emergency vehicles. So there were a bunch of crashes involving that. So I think, at the very least, the fact that autopilot has some specific flaws or had some specific flaws is pretty questionable. And yeah, I think, if nothing else, there should be an investigation to see if there is some flaw here or not. Famously, Tesla has removed the radar sensors which they claim that you can do just cameras by themselves, but cameras have some weaknesses, so maybe that will actually increase the amount of incidents. Yeah, it's an ongoing situation, I guess you could say.
And did they backtrack on that? Because I remember at first it sounded like Elon Musk had this commitment to like, I only want these cars to work the same way human drivers do. And so they're only going to have visual inputs and not like LiDAR or whatever else. I thought they might have backtracked on that position like in the last couple months, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I do know last year they moved to that position. They might have rolled back now and are installing radars again in vehicles. I'm not too sure, but still, I mean, even with radar, they're famously not using LiDAR, which is another safety technology. And yeah, we've also discussed, I think, how self-reported usage of Teslas by drivers, there were a lot more necessary takeovers when the car is doing something wrong, like
Right.
orders of magnitude more than Waymo Cruise. So yeah, I mean, if you are a Tesla driver and you're using autopilot or full self-driving, please be careful. You do need to supervise it pretty closely.
Andrei Karpathy is no longer there looking over the AI's shoulder to make sure everything is okay. He's at OpenAI. Remember that.
Yes.
Up next, we have European companies claim the EU's AI Act could, quote, jeopardize technological sovereignty. And so here we have a bunch of executives, basically, from European companies. They include Renault, Heineken, Airbus, and Siemens. And they've come out and criticized the AI Act, basically saying, like, look, you're over-regulating the space, you're hampering us, and so on. This is in the wake of an event that happened a couple weeks back, I want to say, or maybe it was last week. But anyway, this was when the European Parliament greenlit a draft of the AI Act that, this was after 2 years of developing its rules. And there's still a bunch of steps left. So it still needs to be deliberated in various bodies in the EU government. But there is concern now, and this open letter reflects that concern, that essentially the EU is suppressing the opportunity that AI provides to Europe, as they put it, to, quote, rejoin the technological avant-garde, which I thought was so interesting. It's this like European identity of these companies. They've internalized the reality that they are way, way behind when it comes to tech. Like, you just don't see the same tech success stories as you might in the US and China, in Europe. And they're seeing AI as this like potential way they could get back in, but the regulatory environment now coming down pretty hard, and specifically singling out now foundation models. And the Act apparently says that regardless of their intended application, foundation models are going to have to register their product with the EU and undergo risk assessments and meet transparency requirements and disclose whether they were trained with copyrighted data, that sort of thing.
Yeah, we discussed the AI quite a lot. I think we just discussed it last week too. And now, as it is being finalized and approaching some major kind of steps, it's not too surprising that this is happening. Also, we discussed how the foundation model clauses have been added pretty recently. And there's been some controversy about some of the compliance costs that they would need to do, for instance, with open source technology. So there's going to be a lot of joking and discussing. And yeah, I can say as an academic, to my knowledge or from my experience, Europe, the EU doesn't publish, there are not that many publications in major conferences. It's usually primarily the US and China. And, there are, of course, really great universities that do a lot of great work. But I think similar to how they're behind commercially and companies, just the whole expertise is not there as much as it is in the US and China.
It's tough because this is really a market where the benefits compound. Like AI researchers will leave to go places where they think the best AI researchers are, and so the winners, the rich get richer in that sense. So it's kind of hard for an ecosystem to to emerge from scratch, especially when it's being regulated. But I think even absent these regulations, I think Europe would face an uphill battle relative to the US and UK. But
Very true. And yeah, this is our week's story and the AI act. We'll see. Maybe it's going to be
it's a
a
running
story
theme.
each week.
Tune in next week.
Yeah. We should have like a ChatGPT section and an AI
That's
section.
right.
Yeah. And on to our last section, synthetic media and art. First, we have Adobe stock creators aren't happy with Firefly, the company's commercially safe Gen AI tool. So there's some backlash from contributors to Adobe Adobe's stock image service, that people claiming that their images were used to train the AI model without their consent. You could argue that that is a use of their intellectual property to create content that competes with them in the marketplace. And Firefly has been popular, apparently. There's been a flood of AI-generated images with people trying to make money, I suppose, from them. So, yeah, kind of a pretty understandable problem. And Adobe plans to develop a compensation model for stock contributors and will provide more details. Firefly is still in beta.
Yeah, this kind of raises that, I was going to say, age-old question. I mean, this question is like maybe 10 years old now, but I remember, in the early days of Facebook, I uploaded my profile pictures and all that jazz. And I was like, yeah, it's fine. What are they going to do with it? Are they going to hire somebody to like look at my photos? And then, within 2 years, we had AlexNet, and then we had like all kinds of computer vision auto tagging things that were popping up. And so when I first uploaded my images, I had no idea that this technology would arise, that these new uses for old data would appear. And now that was the discriminative era, where you would basically have these models that could pass commentary on an image and tag it and things like that. But now we're in the generative era where this is happening yet again. So it's like, okay, now how do you feel about your images being used to train a generative model? And it's like, again, not clear what you actually consented to back in the day when you contributed. And there's probably a lot of like, I don't know, I'm guessing there's a lot of legal legal groundwork that's going to have to be laid to figure out where that boundary is.
Yeah, for sure. And this, of course, is reminiscent of a lot of a backlash that happened over Midjourney and similar text-to-image models, with artists really being pretty angry a lot of the times about this AI and the fact that it scraped web for a whole bunch of images, including copyrighted images. And so this question of intellectual property, compensation for use of data, consent, still a question that hasn't been really resolved. And I haven't seen a great kind of a answer to it from Adobe or anywhere else. Like, in some cases you can ask your data not to be used in training. I think going forward, hopefully there will be an opt-in model where by default you can say no, but you can opt in for some compensation. I feel this is probably needed, but we don't have it yet.
Yeah, and as if we needed more complicated shit to worry about. But like, start to imagine, as is already happening with text, like GPT-4 was trained on a bunch of blog posts that I wrote, and now it's generating text that will presumably partly be used to train GPT-5 if they can't fully extract all the places where GPT-4 generated that text. And so it's like, okay, my text was used for GPT-4. Maybe I opt out of allowing GPT-5 to use my text, but it's still going to use the text from GPT-4, which was trained on my text originally, and the snake eats its own tail. And so anyway, this, but for images too, I guess, is going to be eventually a concern.
Yeah, and so if you're signing a contract or user agreement with a website, you might want to actually take a look and figure out if your data.
This is definitely legal advice. We know exactly what the fuck we're on about right now.
Exactly.
Actually, speaking of which, there's a fancy legal word called indemnification that I'm now going to try to pronounce like 3 times without screwing it up, because the next story is that Adobe let me not screw that up. Adobe indemnity clause designed to ease enterprise fears about AI generated art. Okay, this is actually really cool. And even though I can't pronounce the word, I've like had some experience writing legal documents with indemnity clauses. Basically, these are essentially guarantees on behalf of one party that they will support another party in the event that legal proceedings arise. And so essentially what Adobe is saying here is like, yo, enterprise customers, you guys seem really shy about using Firefly, which is the image generation tool we just were talking about. And they're basically coming out and saying, look, Firefly was trained on Adobe's own data that we own. That's the image data that was controversial in the article we just discussed. And as a result, we feel so confident that you are not going to be held responsible legally for using that content that we are going to indemnify you, in the event that there's a third-party IP claim about Firefly generated output. So you go out, you use Firefly, you generate some shit, and then somebody sues you because maybe it looks too similar to their shit, or maybe they think that Firefly used their shit in its training data. Somehow they're pissed about your shit looking too much like their shit. And Adobe's saying, hey, we're going to step in the middle of this and say, hey, we will support you in the legal proceedings. And so this is a pretty bold move, it seems. I mean, to my understanding, like this is some legal exposure that Adobe is offering to subject itself to for this. And they're claiming that they feel comfortable doing this because they trained Firefly on Adobe stock images, which they claim they have broad permission to use, along with some openly licensed content and like public domain stuff. So they think that they're on solid legal ground. And this is, I mean, I think this is them really raising the stakes. At least that's my read of this.
Yeah, this is really clever. So they at least will also pay any copyright claims. And there are many, many ways and places you can generate AI art now, right? But none of them have this guarantee for enterprise users that Adobe has. And Adobe, of course, being a large company, you could sort of probably trust them on this because they've been in the game for a long time, and this is kind of staking their reputation. So yeah, I think it's a really impressive move by Adobe, and I could see them really becoming a huge player in the enterprise, actually commercial use of AI generated art, because it's actually safe. And we know that at some points laws will be passed around this. And as a business, like we talked about how Nature, the scientific journal, said that you cannot use AI generated stuff, partially because the legal regulations aren't clear. So yeah, this is a pretty big move and probably a pretty smart move. But again, we don't know too much about business or regulation, so maybe we're wrong.
Yeah, to Nico's excellent point on the last podcast or whatever, yes, none of this is legal advice, but it
yeah, we're not saying you should invest in Adobe, but
but we know a guy. We know a guy if you want to invest in Adobe. Anyway, cool.
Alrighty, well, with that, we're done with this week's Last Week in AI podcast. Thank you for listening. Once again, you could go to lastweekin.ai for the text newsletter. You can email us at contact@lastweekin.ai for any feedback or corrections or thoughts. You can share this with your friends if you want. You can review us on Apple Podcasts if you'd like, but primarily we would just be happy if you keep tuning in.